Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, a show on India's national broadcaster Doordarshan about Indian foreign policy, India's international relations and India's contributions to global good. Viewers, this episode is dedicated to understanding 80 years of completion of the United Nations. The United Nations is the world's only universal multilateral institution that was founded in 1945. So 2025 is a landmark year where we are looking back and also towards the future of this indispensable institution, but which is now under a cloud of doubt and scrutiny. So what is the future of the United Nations based on the past? Can we change the trajectory significantly, and what can a rising power like India do to bring about a better United Nations? These are the themes of the show. And to discuss this, let me introduce you to a domain expert, person who has a deep knowledge, thinking, writing, and deep insight into the United Nations for over 3 decades, Dr. Vesselin Popovski. Dr. Popovski is presently at the OP Jindal Global University. He's a professor there, teaches international law, and he heads the Center for the Study of the United Nations there. He used to work for the United Nations University in Tokyo and has also been a diplomat, a career diplomat for Bulgaria. Dr. Popovski, welcome to Indian Diplomacy. So good to have you here.
Namaste.
Dr. Popovski, 80 years, we are not really calling it a celebration because there's a lot of criticism and disillusionment with the UN, and that it has not really met the expectations of we the people of the world. But still, 80 years is a long time. It has existed. It did not collapse like the League of Nations. And it does have some accomplishments to its name, and especially along its 3 traditional pillars: peace and security, economic development, and human rights. So if we could start by reflecting a bit on these 80 years and the pluses of the UN. We'll come to the minuses and what can be done to fix them, but let's, 80 years is a milestone. It's the birthday of the UN. So let's talk a little bit about what this 80-year-old person or institution has done for the world, in your view, along these 3 pillars.
Yes, Dean Chaulia, you correctly pointed that 8 years have been a long time, and it's a time for assessment. Usually every anniversary General Assembly does that. And on the 3 baskets, on the 3 pillars, we can see a lot of problems, but also a lot of success. Let's start with the positive picture. Indeed, even in peace and security, there were achievements. If we look at major conflicts in the past, in the 1980s, Namibia, Salvador, Mozambique, Cambodia, later in the 90s, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Timor-Leste, Croatia, Bosnia, all these countries were indeed civil wars and with a lot of casualties at the time. But today, all these countries are democratic, they are rule of law based, they are very much normal, although they still need economic development. But in terms of peace and security, all of these places have been addressed, and all of those places were where United Nations deployed peacekeeping troops, peace building efforts. A lot of finances went for those countries to get peaceful and democratic. On another hand, the second pillar, we have a lot of success there. Again, if we look 70 years ago, 2/3 of the world population was in extreme poverty. And today it's less than 10% of the population in extreme poverty. The question, though, is whether the United Nations did that or other national governments, and I'm referring to India, to China, Indonesia, major countries in Africa. They developed national development programs rather than expecting the United Nations to help much. But nevertheless, to a certain extent, it was also because of the United Nations development program and other projects, the poverty reduction, the education, the Millennium Development Goal. There's much less infant mortality, birth mortality. A lot of diseases have been eradicated: tuberculosis, measles, polio, HIV. Ebola was a very murderous disease 10 years ago. Now it almost doesn't exist. COVID-19 made realization by United Nations with all the science and medical institutes and laboratories producing vaccines pretty fast compared to previous pandemics, and today very small number of people suffer from COVID. And not also to forget the international law, the rules, the trade, the law of the sea. I think the world is much better placed than what it used to be after the Second World War, but kind of often we forget those, kind of over-focusing on the news of the day and of the casualties of major conflicts, which we can also obviously address and be critical about the major failures of the United Nations as well.
Right, yeah. So that's an interesting list, Dr. Popovski, where you are actually listing concrete examples from around the world, especially in the developing world, where the UN played a significant role in transitioning many countries, especially post-colonial societies. I mean, some even argue that, you know, the UN played some hand in the prevention of another world war after 1945, although, you know, there are different interpretations as to what is the reason for wars remaining localized rather than becoming global. But still, these accomplishments need to be put on record, because it's not like, you know, taxpayers all over the world of all the member countries have been wasting their money entirely. I mean, there's some who are saying that the UN has just been a white elephant and it did nothing, you know, so I think it's useful to hear that. Okay, let's come to the problematic side now, because, you know, contemporary, the biggest disappointment is that in terms of international peace and security, one of the main pillars, the UN is really struggling or missing in action. And, you know, there is the unilateral coercive use of force by big powers, but also a variety of wars that are just dragging on and leading to mass casualties. And it looks like, you know, the institution is not so responsive or effective in maintaining international peace and security or even respect for international law. The most recent two big wars in the Middle East and in Europe are just examples of that. So why has the UN become so ineffective? I mean, despite all the hopes, it looks like it's as bad as it was in the Cold War period, or even worse today.
You're absolutely correct, Sreeram, and this is the biggest disappointment, the continuing armed conflict in many parts of the world, not only those you mentioned, but in other parts of the world. In Africa, still a lot of conflicts, in Middle East, in Asia, or violations of human rights generally in many other countries like Myanmar and China and others. Well, I will say it's an inherent constitutional problem. Back in 1945, the UN Constitution, the UN Charter, gave too much powers to 5 permanent members of the Security Council. But not only that, they also provided the right of veto. So for me, the right of veto and the permanent membership is the cancer in the middle of the body. This is what needs to be eradicated. I can understand why 8 years ago that happened. Obviously, those 5 countries were the victors of the Second World War. They acted unitedly against Nazi Germany and militarist Japan. And so how other member states wanted to give them the credit. They basically provided the victors of the Second World War kind of a special status, expecting them to be future guardians of peace. And that was the UN Charter says and expects those 5 members to do. But some of those 5, unfortunately, as we know, turned into aggressors, turned into war criminals. They started the wars instead of being the guardians of peace. And they used the right of the veto to shield themselves from any accountability. You know, every constitution in history limits the power of the already powerful. The kings, the emperors, the governments are limited by the power of the constitution. The global constitution, however, the UN Charter, not only doesn't limit the power of the already nuclear powers back in the 1940s, but triples that power. They have permanent membership and they have a right to veto. So any standard of constitutionalism, this is unequal, this is unfair, and that needs to be changed. And for that matter, there are proposals already in place to convene an Article 109 conference, general conference, to review the Charter, to abolish the veto. First and foremost, as I said, the biggest problem of the organization was the veto. Unfortunately, not many people talk about this. And I'm even more radical. I will suggest to eliminate the permanent membership. No permanent membership, no veto. Let countries compete equally for membership in the Council. Obviously, big countries like India, China, United States, they can be re-elected in the membership. They can stay for 8, 12, 16, 20 years in membership. But nobody is permanent by the Constitution. They can be permanent by re-election, by using their soft power and persuasion.
So you're saying the fact that they're permanent gives them some kind of impunity because they know that ultimately they will always remain at the horseshoe table in the Security Council, and therefore they are misbehaving, the big powers. So, and they're somehow not even big powers because this is an obsolete structure going back to like 80 years, and some of them have actually declined also relative to other rising powers. So you're talking about the representation and the structure of this Security Council, but you have also, you're also very familiar with the debate about the need to strengthen the General Assembly. Now, we have a General Assembly that is legitimate, represents in many ways the international community, 193 countries, all of them are there, and on the basis of sovereign equality of all nation states, at least the principle. So, but people say that the charter and the way the negotiations happened at the original UN was to defang or to weaken the General Assembly or to keep it subservient to the Security Council. The resolutions of the General Assembly are not binding and not mandatory, while the Security Council are enforceable. So what can we do more to strengthen the General Assembly? Because that is where most of us, the developing world, developing countries, we feel that our strength lies there, but by design, it has been made to be weaker than the Security Council.
Yes, you're absolutely right, Sreeram, again. The General Assembly originally as designed to be a representative and legitimate organ, as you said, but it has been weakened by the fact that almost every decision of the General Assembly still depends on recommendations by the Security Council. Ultimately, for example, the election of a Secretary General, although the Constitution, the Charter say it is by the General Assembly upon the recommendations of the Security Council, and the Security Council does something very simple. They just decide themselves, and they put one candidate only to the General Assembly to approve in a kind of a rubber stamping way. So it's like elections in North Korea. You have one candidate, and everybody in the parliament cheers that candidate. Very similarly here, the Security Council decides who will be the next Secretary General, and the General Assembly simply rubber stamp that. Something that, you are right, General Assembly can change. Here we don't need the change of the Constitution. If the General Assembly next year, when the next election comes, decides to do that, they can do that. They can adopt a resolution with two-thirds majority. These resolutions have nothing to do with the veto. The General Assembly can really exercise its power, and I'm always asking myself, and I'm asking experts around the world, why the General Assembly doesn't affirm its powers, most of which are also given by the UN Charter. I'm part of a project that designs the next charter. It's called the second charter. We already go article by article to revise that, and here we'll see a lot of changes. Additionally to the General Assembly and the UN Secretary General, we are also proposing the establishment of a parliamentary assembly. Very similar to what the Europeans have, the European Parliament, which is elected separately from the national elections. Why not have a world parliament, where countries like India, China, Indonesia, the biggest in population, will have a much more representation than simply a single vote like in the current General Assembly. Imagine that bicameral world parliament with General Assembly representing government, but also parliamentary assembly representing people. I imagine the future charter, and we designed that already, to have elections of the Secretary General done by more than one candidate for a single longer term. You know, the problem with the Secretary Generals was that 5 years term, re-elected for another 5 years term. And that the Secretary General very obedient in their first 5 years to the Security Council. They are absolutely voiceless. They are just expecting the first 5 years, and then after being re-elected for a second term, they kind of become a little bit more outspoken and reformist. But that will change immediately if we have a single longer term, 7 or 8 years. And I presented this in New York 10 years ago, and the British permanent representative kind of questioned that and said, no, this is not a good idea because the General Assembly will vote, and the vote will go 60 to 40 or 55 to 45, and how the new Secretary General will work with 55% of the support of the Assembly. And I counter-argue that and say, currently they have only 5% of the support. Only you guys, you five, decide who's the Secretary General. Yeah. Let the General Assembly decide, and let the new Secretary General appoint the second candidate as Deputy Secretary General, and that will unify the world. There are simple solutions here, but again, governments don't listen.
Governments, viewers, very interesting ideas that Professor Popovski is proposing, but governments don't listen. Imagine a world parliament alongside the General Assembly that would make the UN even more legitimate. Imagine a Secretary General who is elected by a majority of the General Assembly and not simply a fait accompli. A lot of things can happen, and some of the changes he's saying don't even require amending the UN Charter or the procedures. So, of course, talking of Secretary Generals, let me go back to Professor Popovski. Professor Popovski, personalities also matter. I mean, sometimes Kofi Annan, one of the, well-regarded former Secretary Generals, once said that the UN can only be as effective or as strong as the member states want it to be, right? But at the same time, leadership and individual leadership also matters. So we can't always say that, we are weak or we are struggling because the P5 or some groups of blocks of countries are obstructing progress. It also requires a degree of, willpower to change things. And if you look back at these 80 years, I think with the exception of Dag Hammarskjöld, 1953 to 61, there hasn't been that kind of a really charismatic or persuasive or a great UN Secretary General who could actually work around the constraints and still achieve significant successes.
Yes, you're absolutely right again. The personalities do matter. You mentioned Dag Hammarskjöld. Unfortunately, in a tragic irony, it is the Secretary General who lost his life in mission at Katanga in 1960s. But also you mentioned Kofi Annan, and somehow again in memories 20 years ago, exactly 20 years ago, during the 60th General Assembly session, we have some changes. We have a Human Rights Council replacing the Human Rights Commission. We had the concept of responsibility to protect being adopted universally by the General Assembly. We have the Peace Building Commission. So 3 major changes happened in 2005. Also, because of leadership, because of championship of Kofi Annan at the time, but you're right, not much after that. What did Ban Ki-moon did? And unfortunately, Antonio Guterres, very little. They keep talking the same speeches, the same reports. They come every year with some summit, and very, very little change, unfortunately. And again, back to my point, if we, and I mean all the member states, elect the Secretary General in an open competition without, bargaining for posts with the Security Council, exactly what happened. Ban Ki-moon, the Koreans, the South Koreans, went to every single Security Council member to get Ban Ki-moon elected against Shashi Tharoor 20 years ago. Yeah. And that was a big problem. And that has been the problem for many, many years so far. The British, the Americans, who wanted Kurt Waldheim, the worst ever Secretary General, he wanted a 3rd term. And they were happy, all of them. In 1971, British, French, Americans, and the Soviets wanted to keep Kurt Waldheim into the post of the secretary. That former Nazi officer, later this was supported, but all by China. It was China, but at that time it was Republic of China, not the Communist China in the sea, that vetoed Kurt Waldheim for 16 times, kicking out of office. So the history of the selection of Secretary General is full of such anecdotes and paradoxes.
Yeah.
But that's something that, as you say, can be changed immediately tomorrow with one vote. We don't need the charter to be amended for that.
Right. So there are some low-hanging fruits, viewers, what Professor Popovski is saying. Sometimes we say, the rules themselves are gamed in such a way that it's impossible to move this, beast, which is the UN, and that. But sometimes the rules are not necessarily opposing change, but there's not enough collective action. So important point. Professor Popovski, coming to India now, we have been major contributors to the UN since inception. We are one of the founding members, even when we were under British colonial rule in 1945. And over the years, on the development agenda, especially on the peacekeeping side, we have played a major hand. We've contributed with ideas, with personnel, sacrificed the lives of our soldiers. And over the time, we have gotten elected occasionally as the non-permanent member for 2 years. So there has been, a disillusionment in India, and people say, well, we just don't get the recognition that we deserve there. And the process, the intergovernmental negotiations are frozen for Security Council reform, and they just drag, endlessly, and it's pointless. There are many people who actually say that it's not even worth investing our energies in the UN. But we continue to do that because it's, it's a major forum for developing countries to express their views and to show collective action. So going forward, for large developing countries like India, which are outside, or even for that matter, Brazil or Nigeria, there's so many you can think about, large populous countries, Indonesia, many of them are out of the Security Council. How should we approach the future of the UN now? Now that the 80 years are done, whatever has been done is done. But going forward, should we say that it's just becoming irrelevant and not worth our time and resources and money? Or should we say this is an irreplaceable organization, end of the day it still does some good, and we have to do something collectively to ensure that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater?
Yes, I think this is the time for India and the Global South to lead the world. Absolutely. India is a founding member. That's something else to celebrate. 8 years ago, India was among the 51 signatures of the UN Charter, and it contributed immensely to the organization with brains, with peacekeepers, with ideas, with support, with everything that India, the biggest democracy in the world, can offer, is very much part of the United Nations history. And I expect India, but also you mentioned Brazil, South Africa, Mexico, South Korea, Japan, Nigeria, and all the rest of the South to be the champions for change. And they are very different from those P5 that were established back in 1945. And they can come with the new ideas, and they can support a new United Nations Charter without veto, and by saying that I will say also without permanent membership. It's time for those countries to say, we don't want permanent membership. Forget this. This is the past. It didn't work. The veto is the biggest murderer of the last 80 years. Because of the veto, 250,000 people die in Syria. How many died in Myanmar? How many died in Gaza? How many died in Ukraine? And all of those, and not all, there are many situations in Africa also. Sudan. Is all part of the veto history. 1 million people, civilian people, died because of the veto in the last decade only. I'm not going even back to Rwanda. So it's really time for change, Sreeram. I expect the Global South, led by India, first and foremost. This is the biggest population in the world, and very much the leader of the BRICS and G20 and the other countries. You see, we have Russia as a paper tiger. We have Donald Trump as a clown. And I wonder why not the new emerging power of the South take over having those ridiculous leaders in the West, in Russia and China as well, and not lead the world. To go ahead, two-thirds majority of the General Assembly, change the charter, remove the veto, and live in a peaceful world.
Yes, I think these are points well taken. Viewers, what Professor Vesselin Popovski is saying is that there are a lot of structural log jams, but they can be overcome. And this is an optimistic undercurrent of the show, because normally people are very despondent about the UN. And most of the time people say that, it's just, we can't even fix this mess. But what we have learned today is that there are many specific interventions that can be made, especially through the empowerment of the UN General Assembly. And there are many other new innovations that can be brought in to fix some of these long ailing issues that have prevented the UN from living up to its full potential. Abuse of the veto power, he mentioned, is a very, very crucial point, especially in the last 10, 12 years with the return of great power rivalries and competition. The veto is being used very, very indiscriminately on so many countries. He already mentioned some, but there are so many important war zones where if only there was no veto, we could have gotten collective action and we could have moved forward and prevented the deaths of millions of people. So, who has blood on hands? I'm going to leave you with that thought, but the point is we can make a better United Nations, and we cannot really afford complete absence of the United Nations either, because there are accomplishments and achievements and quite things that the UN has done. And we have tried to present this balanced picture where end of the day, the world will be worse off if there was no UN at all. But Professor Popovski's call for a new UN, a new kind of UN, is something that we should all be working towards. Let me thank Professor Popovski for decades of work in advocating for change and reform in the UN. Thank you so much for joining me on the show.
Thank you.
Viewers, the United Nations is a mixed bag. Let's not discount its successes and achievements, but the point is the frustrations are growing. And if they are not fulfilled, then people will either abandon the UN or think about setting up alternative world bodies altogether. And there, we are not in a good position if we have to rebuild the global architecture from scratch, because that is going to lead to a lot of displacement and suffering. So let's keep the UN, that's our message in this show, but let's work collectively, especially with Indian leadership and Indian commitment to what we call reformed multilateralism. Let's work towards a reformed United Nations that will progressively meet the aspirations of the coming generations. Thank you for watching. I'll see you again next time. Until then, take care.